Anna, you're drinking already, Joanne?
I am. You know me.
Damn. Hey.
Okay, unplug the whole thing and then plug it back in for me.
Hey, Janet. I see Janet
I hear
Byron.
you, Janet.
You have it muted. Yeah.
Note here on me, it shows Whitney Grover. I'm at my stepdaughter's house.
Great. Good morning, Randy.
Good morning, Joanne.
Hello, this what it does.
Good morning, guys.
Who's this? Oh, that's Randy, right? Okay.
Oh, that's it better.
The printers.
Booksellers are doing great in this environment. Everybody has to have books to put behind them for Zoom meetings. The only difference with Joanne and David is that he's read all those books, most of them 2 or 3 times.
That's correct.
Yeah, between the lake house and the house, Joanne, you have a lot of books.
We certainly do.
There's Diane.
Hi, Virginia.
Good morning, Virginia.
Morning.
Good morning.
Hey, Steve, are you going to control the mute or do we need to do that?
So,
Hey, Richard.
hello. If you can control the mute without controlling the speaker's mute, that'd be great.
The original email,
Yeah, I don't know about my skills. Let me look.
Richard.
Otherwise, we can just ask everyone to mute themselves.
Richard, can you go back to the original email?
No, I tried to find it. I can't. No, I don't know what happened.
Hello, John in Virginia.
I've heard.
Here he is.
Good morning.
Hi, Steve.
Hi there.
Well,
So you're in Arizona?
I've
Yes.
already talked to Joanne. She says it's recorded.
Good.
On the Sunday.
All well from your trip out there, John?
Well, don't know yet. I've got some tests to do this afternoon, and then I'll meet with 2 or 3 doctors tomorrow and kind of get it evaluated and see what they say.
Okay. Good luck.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Hey,
I
Steve.
see that John Sherry has joined us. John, can you hear us?
Yes, we can.
Welcome.
Morning, John.
Thank you.
Hey,
Hi,
Steve.
John Sherry.
Hello, everyone.
Steve, I heard Jack Blank and Richard Spieler talking. I think they may have had a question. Jack, is Richard having trouble finding the link?
Yeah, Richard's having a problem. He said he didn't get the email.
Can you forward, if you've got his email address, you can just forward him the information.
Well, I think I have to forward the email that has the link on it.
Let me see if I can do that.
Okay. Do you all have video on me?
Morning, John.
Or would you like me to do you a favor and cancel it?
No, we want to see everybody.
Okay.
Share screen. There's your name on it. Whitney's name.
It's her computer.
Joanne, I'm not sure Mr. Merrigan could have handled this.
Oh my gosh. You might tell everyone who Mr. Merrigan was.
Mr. Merrigan was the president of the Bank of New Orleans and Trust Company, which is where Richard Spieler and I were commercial lending officers and part-time astronauts and very, very poor grammarians. And David often corrected our writings. He was known from time to time to give us highly technical, grammatical conversations. So he was
Absolutely.
There were many victims of that practice.
Oh,
I
really?
can attest to that.
Yes.
You too?
Yes, sir.
Everyone.
Everyone.
Yep.
You could never put enough commas in a document for David.
That's comma, Dick, comma. He used to cruise by our desk and just, if you were on the phone or whatever, pick up an email or something that was awaiting your signature to go out. Pick it up and read it. He says, "What the hell is this? What in the hell is this? Is this a foreign language, Jackie?"
Well, yesterday, Becky was talking about taking her writings in even before she joined Grundig Transport, and she said once he just said, "This is a mess. You can't send this out." And she said, "Well, can you help me?" He said, "You take Latin in school?" And she said, "Well, at 11th grade or something like that." And he said, "Well, you just need to figure out what your cases are in Latin, and it'll all become clear."
Yeah, that's all. It'll become clear after that. That's all, David.
Yeah.
Becky just eliminated the sentence.
Yes, I just got rid of it. It was not worth it at that point.
Joanne, were you
What
able
David
to
would
send
say,
Richard?
just so.
Right.
Yes.
That's right.
So people are still joining. We're now up to 32 participants.
Wonderful.
We'll wait another minute or so. But it's only 11:01. That's we're actually close to being on time.
Great. Let's see if let's see, is Diana Zimmerman on?
I don't.
She is. You can't see everybody, but she's on.
Yeah,
I can see her on the screen.
Oh,
Okay,
there
great.
she is. She was an early riser.
Yeah.
Right.
It was early.
Yeah.
Here you go.
Some people like Chad Dillingham are playing hard to find and aren't clicking their video.
Hello.
Who's that?
I had 3 people offer to pay me to click my video off.
We'd love to see everyone. This is going to be recorded for posterity, and you want your face in the video, don't you? Well,
Provided it doesn't involve breaking any laws. Are you Mr. Fellhouse?
I am, sir.
Okay, I'm Jack. How are you?
Doing great so far. People are still coming in. All right, we now are pretty close to a full house. What do you say we wait one more minute and then go with what we've got, Joanne? Does that work?
That sounds great.
Okay. I'm going to turn off my phone because invariably it'll ring in the middle of this.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, okay.
Chad, can you hear us? Hi, Claire.
Hi, I moved a window. I was the silhouetted person.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great to see you.
Good to see you, Joanne.
I'm not hearing music.
Neither am I.
I'm not either.
There we go.
Yep.
Here we go.
Wait, is this live? People in there? That's family. Who's playing the fiddle?
Well, hi, everyone. This is an official welcome. I'm Steve Feldhaus, an old friend of David and Joanne's. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. Before we start, I'd like to ask everyone to mute your mic during the first parts of this tribute in honor of David. You remember one of his favorite sayings was, "No talking at the bar." Well, we've all heard David say that a lot. The irony, of course, of the phrase is that it didn't apply to David, thank goodness, because of all the incredible memories we have of talking with David and listening to him talking. So thank you for joining us today for this memory tribute to David and to his many friends and family members. Joanne's going to get us started. Joanne?
Thank you, Steve. Well, first of all, I want to welcome everybody to this memorial tribute for David. The beautiful violin music that you heard at the beginning was played by Sarah Thomas. Sarah's mother and I went to high school together in Pittsburgh. And when Sarah was attending the University of Tulsa, David told her that Beethoven's violin concerto in D major was his favorite. So when Sarah's teacher suggested that she learn it, she associated it with David. Sarah performed it for her master's performance at the Cincinnati College Conservatory of Music. So we're very, very happy to be able to play that for you today. As you know, David passed away on April 23rd of 2020. This has been an extraordinary time for me because of losing David, but also because of the pandemic, which precludes us from celebrating David's life in person. Therefore, we've gathered together several people and we're recording this so that we can remember David and celebrate his life, and also to share it with everyone who couldn't be here today and who couldn't gather in person. I've spent many hours speaking with family, friends, business associates, and classmates of David, spanning 75 years of his life. I was expecting tears, and there were many, but I had no idea how much I would laugh. When I think of David, next to his incredible intellect, what I remember most is his sense of humor and his laughter. Our intent today is to capture the essence of David by sharing stories that we weren't able to tell in his obituary. And so to everyone who sent a remembrance, we attempted to use all of them, but quickly realized that we'd need to produce a 3-hour movie in order to include everything. So please know that if your tribute is not mentioned here, your words and sentiments are treasured, and David's family and I will have those tributes forever. I will be forever grateful to Steve Feldhaus, Greg Hodgen, Becky Hodgen Samples, and Charlie Samples for helping create this tribute, and to each of you for sharing your stories. And of course, credit is due to David for giving us so much great material to work with. Our wonderful friend, Steve Feldhaus, who just did the introduction, has been the leader in developing this tribute. It has been a labor of love, and we've worked on it every week for the past 2 months. Steve will be our guide today through this remembrance of David. And he begins with a statement called the life of the mind, a phrase you've heard David say many, many times. Steve?
Thank you, Joanne. It's truly a privilege and an honor and a pleasure to have this opportunity to share with you some remembrances of a truly great man and a great friend to us all. I use the word great intentionally and with much forethought. David never ran for public office. It's doubtful that there are ever going to be any buildings named after him. There are no great literary masterpieces that he authored. And I would say he did a modest job of accumulating the baubles that are often mistakenly associated with a successful life. In my opinion, David's greatness, the measure of his life, was found instead in his ability to be a true friend to so many, to provide help and inspiration wherever and whenever he could, bringing his tremendous intellect and wry sense of humor, and there'll be more of that today, to every occasion, all the while being true to his inner gyroscope, that compass that kept him focused on his intense belief in right and wrong, good and bad. In a word, his inner integrity. Now, David had many interests and wore many hats during his long life, which was a tribute to his engaging, complex, and incredibly gifted mind. He was a baseball player, a Marine, a police officer, a classical scholar who could read original text in Latin and Greek, a university professor, a law student, a banking specialist, and general counsel for banks, savings and loans, and Grundy Transport. But he was most of all a student of the human condition. He loved to study, understand, and impart his knowledge and wisdom to others. And as you may know, and if you haven't, The titles of his course alone over the course of the lifetime that he taught show a breadth and depth of knowledge that very few of us could ever hope to possess. Now, he also, of course, as you know, had an ornery streak, and he loved to play the contrarian. But having, even with that, and I'd like to tell Joanne, when my wife first met him, she said, "That man is outrageous." But as she got to know him, and as Joanne said in her own case, as she got over the initial shock, she came to love him too. And those who knew David best remember his openness and acceptance of all kinds of people and point of view. And he had a broadness about him. He was equally at home, and you're going to hear some of that in a minute, in the boardroom and in the halls of academia. And at one time, he had decided that he wanted to have a career in teaching. He actually interviewed at Princeton for a professorship, but then felt that he had a young daughter at the time, and he felt he had to choose business to support his young family. And he told many of us that this was the hardest decision he ever made. But he never let that stop him from teaching, which he did throughout his life. An example is when he was working at Grundyke Transport in Enid, Oklahoma, he was an adjunct professor of political science at Northwestern Oklahoma State University, where a good friend of his, Bill Pennington, was the dean. And one day, Dean Pennington walked by the classroom and he saw David pacing back and forth in front of the class, waving his arms, writing on the blackboard, animated. At the conclusion, Bill went into the classroom, viewed the blackboard, and saw that it was all in Greek. Said, "David, do these students read Greek?" David replied, "They do now." We found a note from a student, and there were many, many of them over the years, but from that period, it said, "Thank you for the most enjoyable of all my times at Northwestern. Your class showed me the true meaning of know thyself, the unexamined life is not worth living. I only wish I could have written it in Greek." Little background, David grew up in St. Louis, graduated from Normandy High School there in 1957. His friend Annie Schmidt described him as a roaring boy who always wore blue jeans and a white t-shirt with a pack of cigarettes rolled up in the sleeve. Outrageous, artistic, talented, putting on a big show of not caring that nothing could teach him. David was incredibly fortunate to have at least three we know of, women in his young life who guided and inspired him and helped him become the person that he became. His mother, Edna, from whom he inherited his love of writing, his Aunt Ferris, who died in cancer tragically young, but who was a true inspiration to and believer in David, so much so that David named his firstborn, his daughter Rachel Ferris Schaub, after her. And perhaps most importantly, the influence in David's life came from a teacher, a high school teacher named Esther Gott, who introduced David to the life of the mind. She recognized his promise early on and pushed him. And according to Annie Schmidt, said never let David get away with a glib or slick answer. David spent hours with her in her American literature and creative writing classes. And like everybody else that David touched, he formed a lifelong bond with her. He was with her in 2017 at her 103rd birthday party. Incredible bonds and friendships in David's life. And his relationship with those women perhaps was the origin of his strong support for women. David has throughout his life mentored women, tried to help women become all that they can. If you'll excuse me for one moment, I have to allow someone to join us. All of these women encouraged Dave's love of learning, his academic career that grew out of that also included a love of political philosophy, the classics, American federal period, science, poetry, music, art, and languages. An incredible breadth. Still, just reading that is inspiring, awe-inspiring to me. As you probably know, David proudly served America as a Marine. Now, when he came in, his facility for languages was quickly recognized, and he was sent to a 47-week course out in Monterey, California, in Russian. Someone has just joined. If they would please mute, that would be appreciated. Thank you. So that David's love of language, as I previously mentioned, led him to learn to read original texts in Latin and Greek, and in ancient Latin and Greek. His American hero was always Abraham Lincoln. And Joanne's going to tell us a story about David at the Lincoln Memorial.
Thank you, Steve. David loved Lincoln's second inaugural address and could recite it from memory. And I remember being at the Lincoln Memorial with David, and he began reciting the speech. It was all carved on the wall of the Lincoln Memorial, and I was standing there looking at the wall and reading it. And I looked at David, and David was staring at Lincoln's monument, not the speech. And so I realized that David was reciting it from memory and weeping with a small crowd of people watching in amazement, as was I. When David and I moved to Oklahoma in 1984, we met Mike and Cheryl Hunter. Mike also considered Lincoln one of his heroes, and David and discussed Lincoln at length on many, many occasions. I asked Mike if he would share to David. And so I'm very, very pleased that Mike is here today to share that with us. Mike?
Thank you, Joanne. It's a real privilege to be able to reflect on David, my relationship with him and what he meant to me, and to talk briefly about how I first encountered this bizarre carbon-based life form. Cheryl, who was David's colleague at the holding company for First National Bank of Oklahoma City, began regaling me with stories about this brilliant, boisterous, outrageous, I've heard that word today already, lawyer who she was working with at the bank. And it seemed like every day there was a new story. You can't believe what Schaub said today. And the stories were so fantastic, I began to consider the possibility that Cheryl had created an imaginary friend. But I finally had the opportunity, the experience of encountering David Schaub in the flesh. And it turned out that Cheryl wasn't exaggerating. David and I became fast friends. David, Joanne, and Cheryl and I spent so many wonderful times together, talking about important things and not so important things. Perhaps the greatest memory I have, and it's a wonderful memory, is going to the 1985 World Series with David and Matthew. I'm not sure who was the most immature on that trip. David and I both bought bright red Cardinal warm-ups and baseball caps. And I think Matthew may have kept us on planet Earth most of the time. But what a great experience, and to observe the really wondrous relationship that David had with his young son certainly caused me to look forward to the day when Cheryl and I spawned two sons that we're very proud of. So I wanted to talk for a bit this morning about Lincoln and about David. And I think everybody would agree that Abraham Lincoln was a great man, perhaps the greatest of great men in our country's history. Lincoln was almost supernaturally gifted. Shelby Foote, the great Civil War historian, once said of Lincoln, he's a very mysterious man. He's got so many sides to him. Lincoln was a storied rail splitter, a soldier, a lawyer, and before becoming president, he was a congressman. And although self-taught, his intellect and command of the English language were prodigious. He had the ability to look at problems from both principle and practicality and bring those perspectives together to a solution. As president, he was successful in winning a civil war, uniting a country, and uniting a country on the basis of freedom, meaning freedom for all people. Like David, or like Lincoln, David was mysterious. There is some suggestion that the time Steve described he spent learning the Russian language was a predicate to becoming a CIA agent. Whether that's true or not, we'll probably never know. I hope it's true because it adds to the legend of David Schaub. Like Lincoln, he had many sides. He was a gifted baseball player. He was actually drafted by the New York Yankees. A policeman, an officer in the United States Marine Corps, a lawyer of no small renown, a teacher, a scholar. Like Lincoln, David had the ability to understand and solve complex problems for his clients. And he was able to do so, as Lincoln did, by simultaneously looking at an issue, taking into account history, right and wrong, ethics, and the law. I think David was guided in his career by Lincoln's inimitable talent of channeling immense talents, which David certainly had, to accomplish great things. And David did accomplish great things. And he was, in his own way, a great man, an inspiration to me and many, many other Schaub proteges. So to borrow a line from Ted Kennedy's eulogy for his brother, Robert, David need not be idealized or enlarged in death beyond what he was in life. But it seems fitting now to conclude by applying this adjective to him. David was truly Lincoln renewed. Joanne, thanks for the opportunity to talk about David this morning.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you for those remarks, Mike, and thanks for being such a good friend to David for so many years. I'm going to end this first part, which we call the life of the man. I want to make sure that the record is straight about one key aspect of David Schaub. We all know he had a marvelous memory, an incredible memory, a sharp, sometimes wicked wit. He could tell a story with the best of them. He was a classical scholar, a student of political philosophy and jurisprudence, and that he loved to impart this knowledge and insight to others. But what not everyone knows about David, particularly those people who may have met him later in life, is that he was, in fact, a brilliant lawyer. He had a razor-sharp mind. He was able to cut through windy briefs and obtuse legal references and get to the heart of the matter quickly and succinctly. And maybe even more importantly, he was able to blend that legal acumen with a knowledge of and appreciation of the human players that were involved in his legal dramas, and resulting in advice that was almost always spot on. I worked closely with David for years and years, and I'm a perfectionist, as John Grundike and Greg know, and Virginia. And I'm a very hard judge of lawyers. And I can tell you without reservation that David Schaub was one of the best. And along the way, in notwithstanding his high standards in his drive for perfection, he developed loyal and lifelong business relationships and friendships, which leads us to our second part, which we call the best of us. And I'm going to start that by talking about a couple of events that changed the course of David's life. One of them involved a bet with his mother that he lost. Because after he was in the Marines, David enrolled in the St. Louis Police Academy, becoming a beat cop in December of 1963. And because he was young and single, he was assigned to the rough parts of town. 3 St. Louis beat cops were killed in the line of duty during the year that David was in the department. His mother was very, very worried about David and constantly urged him to quit and go back to school. He had been at Tulane and left there to join the military. And Mike Hunter recounted a story that I want to say about how much his mother worried about David. I don't know whether it's true or not, but it's a great story. David told Mike about a time that David and other policemen were involved in a classic bank robbery, with the robbers trying to shoot their way out of the bank, and David and other policemen returning fire behind parked police cars. David said that the bullets were flying fast and furious when he heard a whisper from the corner behind him. It was his mother, Edna, saying, "David, be careful." David finally gave in, and he told his mother that he would apply to school, but that he made her agree that if he weren't accepted, she would never again complain about his job on the police force. But he was accepted at the University of Missouri. He resigned that August to go to school. He restarted his education, got a bachelor's degree very quickly, then a master's in political philosophy there. But he never forgot his time on the St. Louis police force. And it may surprise you to know that he always said that that was the best job he ever had. And like everywhere else he worked over the years, he made lifelong friends there. His captain, whose name was Papa Slick, took a liking to young David. And when Joanne later met Papa Slick, he told her that he had also urged David to go back to school. David did go back to school, obviously, and then entered a PhD program at the University of California, where he helped pay his bills by teaching undergraduates. But then he decided on a career in law and graduated from law school at George Washington School of Law, where his daughter would later graduate, with honors, of course, David. He took a job with the comptroller of the currency in DC. The OCC, as it's called, charters, regulates, and supervises all banks in the United States. When David joined in the 70s, and you may remember the oil shock and the inflation and Watergate, it was a trying time. Plus, the US had just had the 2 largest banking failures since the Great Depression. Right after David started, the head of the OCC asked Paul Homan to head the problem bank division in the OCC. And David and Paul worked very closely together, plus with John Sherry, another OCC colleague who is on this call. And like so many people whom David encountered on his path through life, Paul and John became lifelong friends. Paul's unable to join us today due to the death of his brother a few days ago. And here's Paul and his wife right there. He sends his good wishes to all, and he's asked me to read the following about his time at OCC with David. I'm sure this will bring back memories to John. This is Paul. Dave and I served together in the OCC's Washington office from 1975 until Dave left in the late 70s to become regional counsel for OCC's Memphis office and region. It was, as I mentioned, it was a turbulent time for the country, banking industry, and regulation of the businesses in America, and especially the banks. And the two bank failures had exposed serious weaknesses in the control of banking in the United States. And I might mention, I was a young lawyer at this time, and I can tell you that in Washington, it wasn't, the OCC was considered a little bit of a backwater, or at least it was until David and John and Paul and the new chair of the OCC cleaned things up. Paul said that Dave and I worked together first on reform efforts, updating bank examination, supervision, and legal enforcement activities, and then later in actually implementing them. During Dave's time in Washington, D.C., he was widely respected and admired for his talents and professionalism, but he was singularly outstanding in two areas. One, with his great memory, language, and communication skills and flawless delivery, he became the go-to person to lead many of the more important OCC meetings with bank directors and management in presenting the OCC's enforcement actions. He always set the right tone and was always willing to coach and help his colleagues in polishing their presentation. His other great skill was as a criminal investigator. He played a leading investigative role in the OCC's probe of the agency's involvement in what later became known as the Burt Lance scandal during the Carter administration. That investigation resulted in a cease and desist order against Mr. Lance and his bank for unsafe and unsound banking practices, and ultimately forced Mr. Lance's resignation as head of management and budget. And there's an interesting codicil to Dave's time in the OCC, because they used to say there were so many times where the shit really hit the fan, or as Dave translated it in his excellent ancient Greek, bull caca hit the fan. And some of it fell on the regulators. The regulators, however, were able to survive because they knew they had the support of the entire OCC office and leadership, as well as their peers and their subordinates. They also had a tradition of nominating what Dave liked to call the best of us, who were recognized as such by their peers. And Paul Homan says that during David's time at the OCC, he was always considered by his peers as belonging among the best of us. That was a tribute to the high regard and respects his peers had for his talents, professionalism, and public service. Which brings up the Order of Albert. David was one of the few people to receive this order. It was an unofficial peer reward like no other. In fact, it was the highest peer reward a bank examiner could receive. Paul Homan got it, and Dave was the only attorney in the OCC ever to receive it. The Order of Albert is a framed concoction. At the top, it has the OCC logo. Next in Latin are the words, Inficis e Justitia. As Dave would translate, the Latin means, in shit there is justice. And there's also language on the award to suggest that whatever hits the fan will not be evenly distributed. And the award is meant to honor high achievement and success, while at the same time memorializing those times when the bull caca hit the fan and some landed on us. At the bottom of the award, there's a generous portion of bull caca, literally on the paper. And this, just to give you the background, Albert was a famous gorilla at the San Diego Zoo. He was famous for attracting crowds by gripping his cage bar with his arms and legs and rattling the cage while he was hooting and hollering as loud as he could. But that wasn't enough, because he would also pick up his droppings and throw them at the guests of the zoo. He died at age 29 in 1978 as one of the most revered animals in the San Diego Zoo. And it was at that time that the Order of Albert Award was inaugurated. Paul said Dave deserved the award. Simply put, he was the best enforcement attorney we had during his tenure at OCC, widely admired and respected by his peers, who had the opportunity, honor, and privilege to have known and worked with him.
Steve, thank you so much. And my thanks to Paul, who could not be with us today, for sharing that story. You got to see the Order of Albert Award. If you would like to see it in person in its three-dimensional glory, it's been hanging in our wine room at the lake for many years and was only taken off the wall to be photographed for this event. Well, next, in The Best of Us, I want to introduce a very important first person. So to set this up, you know, after David's very successful time at the OCC and then as counsel for the Bank of New Orleans, David was hired by John Cherry in 1983 to join him in the general counsel's office at First National Bank in Oklahoma City. John and his wife Kelly and their 3 children were a very important part of our lives, and John was the best man at our wedding. A little bit later, we have a picture of John at our wedding. John hired David to serve as the legal liaison to the bank's problem loan, credit, and workout group, an assignment that, to use John's words, placed them in the mid-'80s oil credit pandemic in the Southwest. The legal team worked closely with Brad Krieger, who led the workout group on the banking side. Brad described the team as a small, tight, trusted group that was incredibly loyal to each other. Our longtime and dear friend, Cheryl Hunter, was a young lawyer in the legal department. She and David developed a unique and endearing friendship. Here's what Cheryl had to say about working with David.
So when David walked into my life, I was in my early 20s. I was a baby lawyer who, like all lawyers with no experience, needed a lot of guidance. But guess what? We didn't necessarily, and I didn't necessarily know how much guidance I needed. At that time, we had a small, quiet group that consisted of the in-house counsel office of the holding company of First National Bank of Oklahoma City. So in walks this guy who would alternatively wear the perfect gray Brooks Brothers, of course, suit, or a blue Brooks Brothers blazer with gray Brooks Brothers pants, always Gucci shoes, Gucci belt, a Gucci briefcase, carrying a Mont Blanc pen, and a gold Rolex watch. Wow, we didn't know what hit us. So I also should mention that Schaub's hair was always perfectly cut and perfectly coiffed. And by the way, when mine wasn't, he sure let me know every time. While Schaub pretty much had a twinkle in his eyes all the time, he was really loud and really opinionated. And oh, by the way, this won't come as a shocker to those that know him. Almost immediately, he figured everyone in the office out, and everyone had a nickname. And because Joanne has the censor buzzer, I'm not going to name all those nicknames, but you can guess. Schaub was just downright scary to me early on. I had no idea what to think of him. And John Sherry, I got to tell you, I didn't know why in the world you brought this guy into our office. But it didn't take long for me to realize I was in the presence of an intellectual and moral giant. And that giant let me stand on his shoulders, and for that, I will be forever grateful. Anyone who was fortunate enough to have Dave as their mentor and who survived, and yes, survival was in question many times, had the absolute best mentor anyone could have. Dave was not only brilliant, we've talked about that, but with that larger than life personality, he had the ability that I've not seen since to talk to you about a task, and that task was impossible. He'd start saying, okay, and I won't use the nickname, but my nickname, here's what you're going to do. And I'm rolling my eyes, but he keeps talking, and suddenly what I thought was a crazy and impossible task became real, and I knew that I could complete it with success, but success wasn't enough. With David, it not only had to be completed with success, but it had to be completed with the highest ethical and moral standards. That was a must anytime you dealt with David Schaub. I can't tell you how many times he would wind me up and send me to the courthouse with direction, and there was never a doubt what I was supposed to come back to the office with. David's skills were put to a test, as Steve mentioned, with all the troubled loans that First National ended up having at the time. No one but David really seemed to know how to attack the problem, so he put together the best and the brightest and went to work, and that group accomplished many wonderful things thanks to David and his huge shoulders. David went from someone who intimidated me and who I thought was out there to someone I credit with making me the best lawyer in person possible. There is no one who had a better mentor, and I am forever grateful to have had the honor to call him a friend and mentor. And I want to touch on something, another strong suit of David's that Mike talked about a little bit. David loved babies and children. And while Mike and I knew how much he adored and loved Matthew and Rachel, we weren't so sure how this wild David Schaub would take a baby. So we trotted to Dallas with a 6-week-old son. We go to see Joanne and David. We walk in the door. The second we walk in the door, David scoops Barrett into his arms, won't let him go, and he immediately begins walking through his impressive array of books and going title by title with Barrett in his arms, talking to Barrett, not a word to Mike or me or Joanne. It was all about Barrett. And then we looked around and David wasn't in the room. So Joanne, Mike, and I chatted for a while, and then we very quietly went in the room where David was. There's David Schaub with a book with a 6-week-old baby reading, you got it, in Latin to a baby. Well, of course, Mike, Joanne, and I were cracking up and giving David grief. He didn't crack a smile, and he said, y'all don't know what you're talking about. This child has great intellect. Look how he holds his head up and how alert he is. He deserves to be read in Latin. So we quieted down a little bit after that, and David wouldn't give Barrett up. The only way we got Barrett back was to let David know that he was going to have a poopy diaper pretty quick if he didn't let him go. So we finally got our son back. David, rest in peace until I join you, and we open up a fresh can of Bush's Purple Hull peas, a variety of filled peas again. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl. David, there's a special place, was a special place in David's heart for you. Those words from you clearly came from your heart. I met David in 1986 or late 85 when he was general counsel of Central National Bank. I was brought in as outside counsel to help resolve a highly contentious matter. Let's leave it at that. And it will surprise none of you to know that David, general counsel, had a wry and totally accurate view of the situation. We worked closely together and became inseparable friends almost instantly. One of the stockholders and the board members of the bank and the chairman of the board committee handling the matter I was brought in to work on got to know David both through his relationship as David as general counsel, but particularly in settling this matter, and was impressed with his legal acumen, as we all were. And that person, John Grundike, who is on this call with his wife, Virginia, hired David to be general counsel of Grundike Transport, a large trucking company where David then worked until his retirement. And this is obviously David and Joanne and John and his wife, Virginia, and myself. I believe that was at an event honoring John receiving an award from the state of Oklahoma. But in addition to his job of helping John Grundike build Grundike Transport into the leading trucking company it is today, David became close friends, as he has with, as I've mentioned, and as we've all mentioned, with the people that he becomes associated with. But with John and with the entire Grundike family, I think he developed a very particular relationship, particularly close relationship. And it won't surprise any of you, I think, to realize that that David's job went far beyond just being a general counsel. One of his special achievements was also a mentoring effort. Greg Hodgen, who at that time when David came on board was a relatively new Grundike employee, and he was climbing up, there's Greg, who also helped us put all this together, I might add. He was climbing the corporate ladder, but he had little management experience. And David spent long hours with Greg, imparting the wisdom he had learned in years in the corporate world. And today, Greg is the CEO of Grundike Transport, and I would add a very successful one. Greg?
Thanks, David. You know, when David came, or Steve, when David came on the scene in 1995, I have to confess I was like a lot of people that the initial meeting is a little bit of a shock. And then getting to know David, he was a special mentor in a lot of ways. He was flying from, I think he and Joanne lived in Plano, and he would fly in on Big Sky Airlines, which actually had a stop in Enid. And he called it Big Scare because he didn't like it flying on that plane. But he came in and immediately started reorganizing a lot of things. I remember learning to read financials from him, and he wanted to craft our financials to look more like bank financials. And it was a significant change that I think helped me understand how to measure our business. And we do some of those things the same way today. I would have to say, first and foremost, David's job with us was as general counsel. And I saw firsthand what an excellent job he did. One of the key legal issues that those days, and it still reverberates today actually, was an attempt by shippers, the people that give us our loads, large companies with large legal staffs, to require trucking companies to indemnify them, which is a legal way of holding them harmless. But they wanted to be held harmless even if they were grossly negligent. And many trucking companies just caved into those demands, and I think we did to a great degree because we didn't really feel we had much power to change it, and we just thought that was the way business had to be done. So many companies just caved into those demands and didn't have these large legal staffs, so that you ended up with a bad contract. Well, it didn't take David long at all to realize that these indemnification demands could ruin trucking companies. And standard insurance policies for liability would exclude coverage if you were indemnifying someone for their own acts of negligence. So they could tell you you don't have insurance for these claims if you've signed that kind of an agreement. So I have a story about a very specific case of this. I was pretty new in the management ranks. I think I was a regional manager when David came here, or slightly after he got here. And we were, as a company, grappling with these demands. And one of our biggest shippers at the time, Koch Industries from Wichita, Kansas, you've all heard about the Koch brothers, same company, was one of our largest customers, and we were trying to negotiate a contract with them for some very significant business. I think at the time they could have been 15% of our revenue, so it was big. We got to an impasse on this issue of indemnification, and they wouldn't budge. And we needed to do something, so we asked to meet with the business people, and that meant we had to drive to Wichita, Kansas. David went, I went, and I think two other people, maybe John Prather, and I can't remember who the fourth person would have been, but we got to Wichita, we got to their headquarters, going through security. They seat us in what looked like a training room. It wasn't a meeting room or a boardroom. It was very nondescript, whiteboards on the walls, hard plastic chairs, basic tables, and then let us sit there for about 20 minutes past our meeting time. Well, in walks the lawyer, and I think there were two business people there with the lawyer, and they sat down, and when they got to the issue of indemnification, the lawyer for Koch just said, we're not going to budge, this is the way it's going to be. David pushed his chair back with great force, picked up his briefcase, and said, well, I don't know what the hell we came up here for, or we have nothing further to talk about. But he was not. It was on the almost rude. I mean, he was very emphatic and said, let's go, and looked back at me as he was walking out the door. I remember being terrified that I'm going to come back from a trip having lost this, I think it was $18 or $20 million a year account because of this action. And so I'm following him kind of meekly out the door. All of us are leaving, and we quickly were called back in by one of the business people and say, wait, we need to talk about this some more. And we actually ended up getting a fair contract with Koch Industries. That's probably an important part of this, but not the most important part of what he did, one of the most significant things he did for our company. We got a contract that was fair, and we decided that we needed to work on all contracts that Grondike Transport was entered into, but also see if we couldn't get some regulatory relief so this couldn't be unfairly pushed on us and other trucking companies. So to set the stage, the United States at the time only had 2 states where that indemnification was illegal. And there's a pretty good sound reason for it legally, I would say, not being a lawyer, but if someone's not responsible for their own acts of negligence, that's pretty bad public policy. Why would they do the right thing? And that was the premise that David said, this is not honorable. We shouldn't be asked to do this anywhere. So Grondike became the leader, the only company that was pushing states. We first tried federally, couldn't get it done, so we went state by state, and we had people working on trying to get these laws passed. There were 2 states when we first started this. Today, there are 43. And all of that can be pointed back to the job David Schaub did for Grondike Transport and with the industry as general counsel for Grondike Transport. Go ahead, Steve. I think maybe we lost Steve. Becky, are we ready to
There,
John's video? Oh, you're back?
there we are. I'm sorry, I was on mute in case my dog barked. I was just saying thank you, and that those anti-indemnification laws were important not only in the trucking industry, but in other industries as well, because the principle that you enunciated applies elsewhere also. So David really made a difference. John Grondike, whom we've introduced before, like so many of us, became dear friends with David. I've spent many hours with both of them together and marveled at their repartee and friendship. And John has produced a short video that he's given us permission to play, and Becky is going to turn that on now.
Good morning. My name is John Grondike. I'm chairman of the board of Grondike Transport of Enid, Oklahoma. I had the pleasure of meeting David Schaub for the first time when I was a board member of the Central National Bank in Enid, Oklahoma, and he served in the position of general counsel. And during that period of time, we had some tough times in the oil and gas industry and all, had a lot of default loans, and at one time the bank had over 300% loan liability exposure to collateral. So very challenging times, but I always appreciate David bringing up all of the issues, and he was very, very complete in his evaluation of banking, loans, and mortgages and whatnot. And I always remember he got to Enid, Oklahoma from a prior job as chief counsel for the First National Bank of Oklahoma City, which at that time was the largest bank in Oklahoma. And they had sent him down in southern Oklahoma to look at a default loan in the oil and gas industry and all. And he came back and said, folks, our collateral is not good, and we have an exposure of probably $40 million that we will not be able to collect. And someone on the board said, well, what do you think? He said, I don't think we can do anything. I think it'll bankrupt the bank. And at that point in time, management of the bank didn't like his attitude and terminated his employment. And that's how he ended up in Enid, Oklahoma. And his comments were right, because the bank did close very shortly after that because of that kind of a problem they had, which other banks had the same thing. David came to Grondike Transport in 1995 as Chief Financial Officer and General Counsel, and served in that capacity for 20 years. And the one thing about David, it was pretty black and white. There wasn't a lot of gray areas in the contract. And he spent a lot of time in accident management and lawsuits and trying to settle those. And our attitude and David's attitude was, you know, the best claim was a closed claim. David always appreciated working for Grondike Transport, being a privately owned company that at that time had been in business for over 75 years, and now we've been in business for 88 years, but took pride in our ethics, our professionalism, cleanliness of equipment, and safety, and which we still support today. And David was a strong believer in that and a very loyal and supportive employee. Good morning. My name is cleanliness of equipment and safety, and which we still support today. And David was a strong believer in that and a very loyal and supportive employee for 20 years. Some of the things that always interested me in David, that I enjoyed about David, was the breadth of his knowledge, as most of you have already seen in his obituary and in other documents, the breadth of his education. And he's went from police officer to Marine sniper to Russian language expert, was there in Berlin during the fall of the Berlin Wall, worked for the comptroller of the currency as counsel for 20-some years, and worked for the First National in Oklahoma City, and worked for the bank here in Enid for a long time. So had a very varied career, and everyone appreciated his knowledge. And I think probably what he taught me most of all, he could kind of be a contrarian. He would always take the other side of an issue, but he gave you the opportunity, or forced you to see, make sure you looked at all of the issues. And there's a lot of times when everyone wants everything to be good, but he would point out all of the negatives and why you shouldn't do a deal, as well as why you should do it. And that taught me to look at and evaluate things a little differently. David and his wife Joanne were good friends with my wife Virginia and I, and have spent a lot of great times together at Grand Lake, at the Cherokee Yacht Club and Shangri-La, and have a lot of fond memories of David and his wife on those events, and trips to Mexico for anniversaries and celebrations with Guillermo Barachoa, who was the founder and the chairman of Transporte Intermex. And we're still good friends to this day. David, we're going to miss you. During David's career, he served as a professor at the University of California on the Berkeley campus and all toward the end of the Vietnam War. And students were protesting and having demonstrations on the campus and all. And one of the things I always remembered, and as I said earlier, David, to take the opposite view on purpose, just to make sure that you talked about all the issues and everything. And the students overran his office on the second floor and threw all of his furniture out the window at one occasion, which I think he enjoyed it. He liked that challenge and the students' response. But probably one of the best ones of him being a professor, he was teaching a large class of 200 to 250 students in a large auditorium. And the administration had decided during that time that it was in vogue to have students fill out surveys in regard to what they thought about the class, the subject, and what kind of job the professor did. So Mr. Schaub, Professor Schaub said I was required to pass that out and all, and I was on the podium and said, anyone have any questions, just raise your hand. And he said, I passed out all of the surveys, and one young student in the back put up his hand, and David said, I recognized him, and he said, Professor Schaub, do you spell shitty with one T or two T's? And that was just about the end of the class. And he said, that student went on to be a straight A student in my class. So he said, I learned, don't be taking questions, walk back to their desk and quietly lean over and say, what can I help you with? He said, that about tore the class up.
Well, John, thank you so much. Wonderful times together. Our next segment is family. David's family is two children, Rachel and Matthew, and his brother Ed. Joanne?
Thank you, Steve. Well, we've had a few references to Rachel and Matthew, but I do want to talk about them. So David's children, his daughter, Rachel Ferris Schaub, and Matthew Lincoln Schaub. Here's a picture of them. They brought David great joy, and he is immensely proud of them. Rachel was his firstborn and was named after his dear Aunt Ferris, who believed in David wholeheartedly and was a very influential woman in his young life. David would often tell me how proud he was of Rachel, who was very bright and loved to learn. You can see this picture of her as a little girl. One of his favorite stories was when he was in law school, and it was exam time, and he took Rachel to his exams with him. And she sat next to him patiently. She occupied herself with a book while he took his exam. And she later graduated from that same law school. Rachel and David also shared a love of languages. She spent a few months in Russia while studying abroad, and to David's delight, they were able to converse in Russian. Both David and Rachel's mother valued education and were so proud of Rachel's academic achievements. She earned her undergraduate degree from Wellesley College and law degree from George Washington University School of Law. Matthew. David's son Matthew was named after his male hero, Abraham Lincoln. Matthew too is very bright. He attended the Newman School in New Orleans and graduated from Union College. David and Matthew shared a love of baseball, particularly St. Louis Cardinal baseball. They read the box scores every day and talked endlessly about baseball. This is a picture of Matthew at the World Series. He was there with David and Mike Hunter. Mike referenced it earlier. David and Matthew made a pact to go to every World Series in St. Louis when the Cardinals were playing. And they had a great time. They were decked in Cardinal regalia from head to toe. Matthew was a very good athlete and interested in all types of sports. We had a great time playing golf, but mostly teasing David about how poor of a player he was and improving his lie when he wasn't looking. We had many good times with Rachel and Matthew on their Christmas visits to Oklahoma. This is a little bit of silliness. I don't know, maybe David and Matthew got new underwear that year, but we had great times on those visits and when Matthew visited us at the lake. He loved them very much. David also had one brother, Ed Schaub, who sadly passed away on May 20th. This is a picture of us visiting Ed and Marcel at their house in Topeka. Ed and I spoke almost weekly when David was in the hospital. His help and guidance came at a very critical time for me, and I will be forever grateful for his help. Shortly after David and I were married, we started a tradition of celebrating Thanksgiving with Ed, Marcel, Sandy, and Susan at their house in Topeka, and I was thrilled to be a part of their family. David's brother Ed had a long and successful career in government relations, working for major companies like Southwestern Bell, Westar Energy, and was a partner in his own firm with Pete McGill, a former Kansas State Speaker of the House. Ed was one of the loveliest men I have ever known. My brother Vance and my father also had a special relationship with David. That first picture was David with my father. And I just want to quickly say that when my father passed away, David delivered a moving and flawless tribute to my father with no notes and very little time to prepare. People were so moved by his speech that they asked him for a copy of what he wrote for my father. And of course, David didn't have it in writing because he composed it in his mind and delivered it. So while the rest of us were visiting after David gave the eulogy, David went off to the side and sat down and wrote out his remarks and gave them to people. And I kept it all these years, and it's safely tucked away in our David Schaub Memorial Tribute Vault. My brother Vance is the big guy in one of the pictures you'll see. There he is on the left, that's Vance. David referred to him as my brother-in-law, the building with feet. David was very intimidated by Vance, which was quite funny to watch. I'd like to share a few words from a letter that Vance wrote to me about David. He said, David gave me hope that everything would work out in the world and in our country. Vance said that David helped him be a better person and have confidence in himself, to constantly search and acquire knowledge, and to gain better perspective for the decisions that he would have to make throughout his life. David's nickname for Vance was Laddie. He'd say, learn from your mistakes, Laddie. Well, Vance, one of my favorite things that you wrote was that you would try to do for others what David did for you. And Vance, to that, David would say, well done, Laddie. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you, Joanne. Our next segment is a variant on family. It's about David and marriage. Those of you who know David, I'm sure, are starting to smile about now. If you're not, you will. Because David lived and loved in his uniquely stubborn, humor-filled way. Bill McNutt, who is on this call still, I believe, and I and others used to chide David that we would say, David, if you don't stop smoking and drinking and driving without a seatbelt and not exercising, you're going to die a premature death. David, his response was pure David. He would say, Steve, I'm married. I don't want to live a long life. David adored Joanne, but there was nothing that his wicked sense of humor would not touch. Joanne?
You're exactly right, Steve. So the first picture we're going to put up is a picture from our wedding. David and I were married in 1984 at Oakmont Country Club, which is famous for its golf course. And this is all of us on the steps of Oakmont Country Club, and Cheryl and Mike Hunter are up there in the back, and John Sherry was there. Well, I recently posted this picture on Facebook, and my friend Ellen Fleming, who knew and loved David, asked why David looked so pained in the picture. David said, tell her that I thought I was being invited to play a famous golf course and I ended up married. David made a lot of jokes about marriage at my expense, all in good fun. When people asked David how long we'd been married, he'd respond, 846 years. David was also happy to share his wisdom on marriage freely. David's nephew, Mike Brinker, remembers his first meeting with David and his comments about marriage. We were visiting David's brother Ed and his wife Marshall at Thanksgiving in 1989. Mike had just become engaged to David's niece, Susan Schaub. David said, "Mike, have you spent much time around married men?" Mike asked what he meant, and David said, "Well, look at your father-in-law's face and look at my face. Are you sure you want to end up like this?" David likened marriage to a lifetime installment plan that never gets paid off. Fortunately, Mike appreciated David's humor. He told me that he loved that David was so straightforward and genuine and never put on a persona. He said David's natural wit and honesty stayed with him, and he carried them as lessons into his happily married life. He and Susan have been married for 30 years. I'm going to conclude this section on marriage. At Steve's request, he asked me to talk about what David meant to me. David and I have a longtime friend who I hope is listening today, who offered to pay me $1,000 if I would tell him why I married David. I would just laugh and smile and say, that story is worth much, much more. To many, David and I were a bit of an odd couple. We were different in so many ways, but we were not mismatched. Like you, I was one of the lucky ones who got David almost immediately, or at least shortly after the shock and awe wore off. This picture you're seeing is right after David and I became engaged. David would tease me and joke and make me laugh. He never let me take myself too seriously. He readily accepted my need to work, to be self-sufficient, and to achieve my own financial independence. And despite his many jokes, he was extremely supportive of all women and encouraged me in everything I did, in every way, and at all times. He was my biggest supporter, and he was my rock. I would never have become the person I am today without him. Life with David was fun. It was interesting. It was surprising. It was full of culture and art and poetry. There was so much to talk about and so much to learn. We didn't always agree on things, but we worked around our differences and tried not to focus on our flaws. We loved one another deeply, laughed, and had so many important and meaningful friendships. David had a favorite quote by the German philosopher Hegel. Many of you have heard David say many times, "Friends make you better than you could ever be alone." David was very intentional about telling his friends how much they meant to him. Our purpose in this tribute has been to describe the attributes that make David so special. So here are a few remembrances from friends that do just that. I think before we go into that, we have a few pictures to share. This is David, that was David's quote about Hegel, and this is a wonderful tribute that the Ridge Grill put up when he passed away.
David is sending a request. I have a note here from him. He's saying there's a misspelling in that.
Yes. He will forever correct our grammar.
Right.
They knew of David's love for the Redbirds and made this sign for him. And then we have a few pictures of friends, and I wish we could include them all. So with this, let me introduce Randy Wheeler, who has a remembrance of David that he would like to share. Randy?
Randy, you're muted.
Randy.
There we go. Pardon me.
That's okay.
I was fortunate to meet David in the fourth quarter of his life. And I was have a very close and special relationship with the man I called my adopted father. Of course, David's response was always, I would slit my wrist if it was true. We had so many meaningful conversations about the right and wrong way to handle a particular issue, many of them over a fine scotch. Whether it be personal or business, he always guided me to the right way. He called it adhering to the code. If you knew David, words like unique, intelligent, witty, and integrity easily describe him. David was my adopted father. He adhered to the code of principle and values. I loved him more than I can express, and I will miss him dearly. Thank you very much. Now I'll hand over to RJ.
Oh. Thank you, Randy. Can you hear me, guys?
Yes.
Okay. It was a true connection when we first met David and Joanne back in 2007. That year, we bought a boat, and then we moved that boat to Cherokee Yacht Club. And I remember that day one, when we were in the dock, David saw me and asked my name, and I say, RJ. And Dave, with that look intimidating me, he said, no, tell me your real name. So I introduced myself, I say, David, my name is RJ Gomez. And he went like, he responds, you know what, now I like you. Man, I felt this relief after, that man says, I like you. David was very, very special to us. He and Joanne, truly impacted our life. We became good friends and family. They turned into our family. We spent so many good times together that we will never gonna forget. David was an extremely intelligent person. And I remember asking him more than one time for some business advice. He was a little my mentor in my business, which at that time when he was 2 years old. To understand David, you really need to know him very well. Sometimes he pretend to be a tough person, but at the end of the day, that man has a big heart. Several years back, he asked me to start planning my family trust. And I always respond to him, yes, one of these days, one of these days. He kept asking me, and I didn't even try to start. Well, one day he drove from Tulsa to my office with a friend of his that was a lawyer. And in order to force me to start preparing my family trust, which I did. Sorry guys, but if that's not considered a super caring person, then I don't know what caring person is. Millie and our kids have such a close relationship with him. We celebrate Father's Days, birthday, high school graduation, college graduation. I mean, my both kids' wedding, which, we were very thankfully that David was able to attend my daughter's wedding 3 months ago. As an immigrant, when you leave your home country in hopes to be able to have better future, but sacrifice has to be made. Our major sacrifice is your family. You no longer have that support from your extended family with the arms reach. David helped fill that void in our family. He always treated us well with such compassion, the type of care of compassion that only a family member can show. Every time that we saw any of us, his face was just light up, and a big smile, and he would stop whatever he was doing to give us a hug, yell out our name, and just again give us a hug. It's just been that he has been there for us in every possible way. Even he didn't need it to. He just genuinely wanted to be there for us wherever possible. He's the definition of what family is supposed to be. That was means so much for us. And he was part of our family, and he always wanted it. We'll miss him deeply. We love RJ, Miri, RJ, Maria, and Jan. Thank you.
Thank you, RJ. And next we have Diana Zimmerman to share a remembrance of David.
Well, David and I didn't become friends until the last few years of his life, but it was definitely a friendship that blossomed very quickly. David had what I call a shtick that he did whenever he met people for the first time, and some of you have touched on some of those things that he would say, like he would tell the women at the table not to talk, or he would tell a joke or two about how large a certain part of his anatomy was. Or he would point to the husband of a woman at the table and tell her that she had terrible taste in men. But underneath that surface comedy routine that he did was a very deep and thoughtful, philosophical man. He told me early on that two of his favorite things were teachers and Italians. He credited that high school teacher that Steve mentioned for literally saving his life. Those were his words. He said she saw something in him that he didn't know he had, and it changed the course of his life. And he loved Italians because he was in Italy for a while after he was in the military. And he said the Italians had life figured out, with their priorities being food and love. And when David found out that I was a teacher and Italian, he knew we were going to be good friends. David told me that if he ran the world, teachers would be the highest paid profession. That's how highly he regarded education. When he was a college professor, he told me that on the first day of class, he would ask his students to take out a piece of paper and answer the question, how do we know that we know? In other words, what is truth? That was the question that David spent his life trying to answer. And he and I spent many an hour discussing that question. We didn't always agree on the answer, but we truly enjoyed the debate. I will truly miss David and all of our discussions that we had, lots and lots of discussions at Hookers. And I will miss our friendship and our love of whiskey and scotch. And I'll miss walking into Hookers with him having that big smile on his face and him greeting me saying my name in the Italian way, Miss Diana. So thank you, Joanne, for inviting me to share some of these remembrances of David. And I'm gonna turn it over to Barry and Laura.
Thank you, Diane. Very shortly after Laura and I met David and Joanne, the banter began. And Laura, it was a little loud. We met him over in Hookers at Cherokee Yacht Club, which he loved to go over and frequent. And we met them for the first time there. And Laura said, my name is Laura. He goes, Lori. She goes, Laura. And he goes, Laura. And so from that point forward, she was known as Miss Laura. And as many have said, he had several nicknames. He referred to me as the captain because of the boating skills that he felt that I possessed. And so I was forever deemed the captain. But along those lines, when Miss Laura and David started their relationship, Laura took a long sabbatical from writing. And she'd been writing for a long, long time, writing children's books. And she had a long sabbatical from that. And David, after investigating all of her interest, as he did with everybody he knew, he inspired her to get back into the writing back in 2017. And through his encouragement and help, she was actually even able to get a literary contract, the second one of her writing period. And David would always edit the books and come back with his critical demeanor to make it the best that it could possibly be. And, during one of these times, David and Laura they had long discussions about things. And as everybody knows, David had an uncanny way of quoting everything, just about everything that he'd ever read. And after David was quoting things from Plato and being a student of Socrates and listening to him about all the philosophers, Laura came up with this idea of a children's book that incorporated the great quotes of the philosophers. And David loved the idea and agreed to edit the book and work with her on this. And Laura put a story together about two frogs, George and Georgette. And they had a playful banter, quoting philosophers, poets, presidents, and other notable figures. And when creating George's character, Laura drew from David's personality. And I think, you know, he liked to think. He didn't like to walk or exercise, but he had to be nudged to do something that he didn't really want to do. Believe that or not. But what Laura is going to miss most about David is not just their friendship, but their lengthy discussions. You know, Laura was a history major, and she enjoyed their conversations regarding historical events, and he would often quiz her and challenge her, as he did all of us, and he kept her on her toes. And you know, he really kept her poised, because she had to stay quick on her wit to stay in the game and stay on topic with David. After these long discussions, he would always say, "Captain, does she have to always talk this much?" And David and I had a very interesting relationship. You know, I've had a lot of friends and acquaintances over my 59 years, and I've been in a lot of different businesses, but David came along, and he was not a friend like I'd ever had before. You know, friends often look at people that they have an affection for, and you know, your friends, and you often attempt to improve that friend in some way. Most people focus on wealth or success, popularity, or some personal enjoyment of that friend. You know, you're always trying to make them better and enhance the relationship. But you know, David was on a different path. His primary focus was to raise my intellectual perspective through a paramount of historical events of teachings and things that people typically ignore. Our relationship was never about what I could do for him or what he could do for me. It was it was always about really seizing the quality of the experience and the time that we spent together. You know, he would say, "Captain, sit down, let's visit," which was wonderful. And I will miss that greatly. But you know, when he introduced me to people, he would do it with such pride. It would just resonate in the introduction when he would introduce me to someone. And it just made me feel important. Hell, it made everybody feel important. But he himself was so incredibly important to the people that treasured his friendship and his knowledge and his guidance. It was mutual. It was never an option for him. And he pushed me to improve a part of my life, as he did many of us that have spoken today. And a part of your life that most people wouldn't even consider. For this, I'll be forever grateful. He's a friend that I'll never forget, and his presence will always be with me. Thanks, Joanne.
Thank you, Barry.
Thank you. Laura, did you want to say something?
He said it for me. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, thank all of you on behalf of Joanne and David and all his friends for those moving tributes. And I think I join Joanne in saying that we're only sorry that our time limitations made it impossible to include similar comments and tributes from all the rest of his many friends. But I think what you've said was indeed moving. Thank you. And now I want to say that it seems fitting that we end it the same way that we spent so much time with David, and that is laughing. So I want to ask everybody to unmute their systems, because you're free to remember David's boisterous laughter and to laugh along with us as Greg Hodgen recalls a few of the seemingly infinite number of what we call Davidisms. Greg?
Thanks, Steve. I hope I can do these justice. We have laughed so hard remembering these, and when I ask people to come up with some of these, so if I don't get the tone or tenor right, I think you will all hear David's voice in your head. And I've grouped them into areas because I heard these over the 20 years that I knew David or longer. First one is on marriage and women, which he loved to joke about. One I heard a lot was no talking at the bar. One that I hadn't heard until we started playing for this, and it was Mike or Joanne maybe saying it, was no women at the World Series. Did I get that right, Mike? If Joanne asked him something that she wanted him to do that he didn't want to do it, he would say, would you like to put a broom in my hiney and sweep? Or you can address that request to the fat chance department. One of his favorites even had a sticker on his office door that was something like this, but he would say, you know, it wouldn't cost much to have you beaten. He had another one that I liked. I need a picture of that poor bastard so I can have somebody to feel sorry for. And the final quote I remember from his sections on marriage and women, he would go, oh, women are so ungenerous.
Yes.
So David the teacher loved to correct grammar, and I heard someone talking earlier about having their letters and things corrected over and over, and he would say, you're using too much here, you don't have enough here. So I learned a lot about editing how I wrote, but he would say this, I think you probably all heard this, there are 54,000 words in the English language. It is not necessary to use them all at once. He also would say, oh, he would do this groan. I'm going to die from terminal listening. And he would say, God made us all and many of us much worse. So I have some really fond memories of his time at Grondike and some quotes that he said. One of them was, I have no present recollection, Senator. And sometimes it would be to Chairman Grondike, I have no present recollection, Mr. Chairman. In his job as CFO, he had an expression, there is no money and the outlook is grim. I just learned this. I don't think even the group that helped put this together knows this story. And I'm told it's true by this employee. This employee and David were going to, he said, a courthouse for a deposition. And while they're sitting there waiting to go in, David leans over and says, would you like to see my new Glock 40, which I have in my briefcase? And he pulled it out and showed it to him. And the guy was afraid they were going to get thrown in jail. Sometimes if you describe something to David and he wanted to emphasize it, he would go, just so, just so. I also recall, and I think he said this in front of a lot of employees, we were having a year that wasn't very profitable, and we were all down in the dumps and kicking the can. And he said, you know, times are tough, but if they don't improve in the next 54 years, we'll be in trouble. The last one about Grondike years, I think we have a picture, Becky, of in the foreground on the right is Guillermo Barachoa, his wife on the left, Rocio, and then you can see David and Joanne, and behind Guillermo is Max Barton. So I don't know where this was, probably some trucking show, but David and Joanne went to, I think, Joanne, did you go to Watoko to his,
Yes.
to Fossil? Well, David came back having learned a drinking expression, a salute, that is now something we use at Grondike and have used for years. And it goes this way. Por la justicia de la revolución y la consternación de los enemigos de la república. In English, that is, to the justice of the revolution and to the consternation of the enemies of the republic. And he loved this salute, and we use it to this day, which naturally leads into a great joy of David's life, drinking. He had some great expressions. Upon learning that someone didn't drink, he would say, I can't imagine waking up in the morning knowing that's the best I was going to feel all day. I have not heard this, but I was told that when it was sadly time to go at the Ridge Grill, he would say, how much do I owe you, Sammy? And then his most famous line that I have heard many times was, more whiskey, damn it. So I think David would probably be a little bit irritated with us that we're having this tribute before noon, when he would say a gentleman never does anything meaningful before noon, and that we can't have a drink while we're doing this. So I think it is 5 o'clock somewhere. David is looking down from heaven with a drink and probably having a little chuckle at our expense. So I would close on a more serious note with some famous, I think, favorite quotes of his. You've heard a couple of these, but I heard them a lot. How do we know what we know? Or how do we know that we know? Diana talked about that one. How many of you heard this one? The unexamined life is not worth living. Famous Socrates said this, and if I heard it once, I heard it literally 100 times. And the one I identify most with, David, is know thyself. And if you look up, I actually researched this, and it's been said by many people, Socrates, Plato, and others. Socrates said it a lot. But in a 10th century Greek encyclopedia called the Suda, know thyself is a warning to pay no attention to the opinion of the multitude. Anyone that knows David Schaub knows he didn't care the opinions of the multitude. If he were the solitary person to believe something, he would espouse that honorable view of what he thought was right. And I think David certainly demonstrated know thyself.
Greg, thank you so much. It felt great to hear everyone's laughter as you were recounting those. And it brought back the memories of all the times we spent laughing with David. And just as it was hard to see David's vital forces receding in his last few years, it's equally difficult to contemplate his absence now. But when someone has lived as fully and vigorously and honorably as David did, I contend that we can't mourn his passing, but rather celebrate his life and our good fortune to have been a part of it. David, as Joanne mentioned, gave a impromptu eulogy at the funeral of Joanne's father, Vance Scoble, where he said of Vance's life, it was a life of dignity without advertisement, of nobility without arrogance, of wit without rancor, of striving without jealousy, of success without selfishness, and he did not know hatred. I didn't know Joanne's father, but I did know David, and I don't believe anyone could have better described his life. May David rest in peace, and may our memories of him remain with us always. Thank you all so much. And that's going to conclude today. Thank you for being part of David's life and for sharing this with us. I say that as David's friend, as Joanne's friend, and there will be a recording of this that Joanne will have available if you have other friends of David's that you want to share it with. Joanne, can I sign us off now?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.